I'm sitting there on Christmas morning, watching my sister-in-law Jessica unwrap a diamond tennis bracelet while my husband Mark gets a Rolex. And his teenage niece squeals over some designer bag that probably costs more than my car payment. Everyone's gushing about how generous Linda is, how thoughtful, how amazing. And me? I'm holding a mug of coffee like it's a prop in this twisted holiday play because there's literally nothing under that tree with my name on it, not even a card. My mother-in-law is beaming at everyone except me, acting like I'm invisible furniture. Mark leans over and whispers in my ear, "Something's very, very wrong here." 3 weeks later, she called asking for $47,000 back. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Let me back up and tell you how this whole nightmare started. When Mark first introduced me to his family 3 years ago, Linda seemed normal, even pleasant. She hugged me, told me I was beautiful, said she was so happy Mark had found someone. I actually thought I'd hit the jackpot because Mark had warned me she could be particular, but every guy says that about his mom, right? The red flags started small, like when she'd ask about my job and immediately follow up with, "Oh, that's nice. Mark's ex-girlfriend was a lawyer." Or she'd compliment my outfit and add, "You're so brave for wearing that color with your skin tone." Those comments that sound supportive but leave you feeling vaguely insulted, Linda was a master of that art form. I tried so hard to win her over. I brought flowers, remembered her birthday, asked about her book club and garden, even learned to make her famous apple pie recipe, thinking we could bond over baking. She watched me measure ingredients with this tight smile and said, "Well, it's not quite the same, but I'm sure it'll be fine." Then made her own pie anyway, just in case. Mark didn't see it at first because she was different when he was around, warmer and more inclusive. She'd save her little barbs for when he stepped out to take a call, leaving me feeling crazy, like I was imagining the coldness in her voice when she said my name, or how she'd talk around me instead of to me during family dinners. The worst part was how she'd immediately switch back to loving grandmother mode the second Mark returned, laughing and asking about my work and touching my arm affectionately, leaving me wondering if I'd hallucinated the previous 10 minutes of Arctic treatment. Every interaction felt like a test I was destined to fail, and she was keeping score in a game where she'd never explained the rules. The favoritism became impossible to ignore once I started paying attention. Jessica could do absolutely no wrong in Linda's eyes, while I apparently couldn't do anything right. When Jessica got engaged, Linda threw her this elaborate surprise party and invited the entire extended family, posting dozens of photos on Facebook about her perfect daughter. When Mark and I got engaged 6 months later, Linda suggested we have a small, intimate gathering because some people prefer low-key celebrations. The guest list she helped us create somehow forgot to include half of Mark's cousins who had mysteriously been essential to Jessica's party. Then there were the weekly mother-daughter spa days that Linda and Jessica enjoyed, complete with social media posts about their girl time and special bond. I mentioned once that it might be nice to join them sometime, and Linda looked at me like I'd suggested we rob a bank together. "Oh, that's so sweet of you to offer," she said, "but this is really our tradition. I'm sure you understand." When I tried to talk to Mark about feeling excluded, Linda had somehow already planted seeds about how I was trying to change family dynamics and maybe feeling a little insecure. She'd tell him things like, "Sarah seemed upset about something yesterday, but I can't imagine what I could have done wrong." The gaslighting was masterful. If I brought up a specific incident, suddenly her memory became fuzzy, or I had misunderstood her tone, or she was just trying to help. My personal favorite was when she planned Jessica's birthday dinner at a restaurant that she knew I was allergic to, then acted shocked when I couldn't eat anything. "Oh my goodness, I completely forgot about your shellfish thing. You should have reminded me." Meanwhile, she remembered that Jessica didn't like cilantro and made sure the entire menu was cilantro-free. When I pointed out this inconsistency to Mark later, Linda had already told him how terrible she felt about my allergies and how she'd never forgive herself for such an oversight. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind, constantly questioning whether I was being too sensitive or if Linda really was orchestrating this elaborate campaign to make me feel unwelcome. Spoiler alert, I wasn't being too sensitive. Here's what you need to know about Linda's financial situation to understand how completely unhinged this whole story becomes. She'd been widowed for about 2 years when I came into the picture, and Mark's dad had left her very well taken care of. We are talking a paid-off house in a nice neighborhood, a healthy life insurance payout, pension benefits, and a retirement account that could fund a small country's defense budget. But somehow, Linda had transformed into this perpetual victim of financial hardship who couldn't stop talking about money. Every conversation eventually circled back to how expensive everything is these days, and how she was living on a fixed income, like she was surviving on ramen noodles and government cheese. She'd sigh dramatically about the cost of groceries while buying organic everything, complain about her property taxes while getting her nails done weekly, and mention how hard it is to make ends meet right before booking another cruise with her book club friends. The manipulation was next level. She'd call Mark in tears about being a burden to her children and how she never wanted to be that kind of mother. Then in the same breath suggest we all take a family vacation to Hawaii because life is short and we need to make memories. When Mark would point out that Hawaii was expensive, suddenly it became about how she just wanted to spend time with her family and maybe we could find a way to make it work together. Translation: she wanted us to pay for it while she got credit for the idea. The guilt trips were legendary. She'd talk about how lonely she was, how she never wanted to ask for help, how she was just trying to be independent, and then somehow we'd end up splitting the cost of elaborate family dinners or weekend getaways that she had enthusiastically planned. Jessica always seemed to have a convenient excuse for why she couldn't contribute her fair share, leaving Mark feeling obligated to cover the difference because Mom shouldn't have to worry about money at her age. I watched this pattern play out dozens of times, with Linda expertly playing the role of grieving widow while orchestrating expensive family activities that somehow always required other people's wallets. She had turned martyrdom into an art form, and everyone around her was too guilt-ridden to call her out on it. That should have been my first clue that something much bigger was coming. So imagine my confusion when, 3 weeks before Christmas, Linda suddenly transformed into the ghost of Christmas generosity. This is the same woman who had spent 2 years complaining about every penny. Remember? She started calling Mark almost daily with breathless updates about her special Christmas surprises for everyone. First, it was Jessica's gift, a diamond tennis bracelet that Linda described in excruciating detail, down to the carat weight, and the fancy jewelry store she'd driven 2 hours to visit because only the best would do for her daughter. Then came Mark's present, a vintage Rolex that she'd apparently been saving up for because every successful man needs a quality timepiece. She was practically giggling with excitement as she described how she'd researched different models and consulted with jewelers to find the perfect one. Next was Jessica's 15-year-old daughter Emma, who was getting some ridiculously expensive designer purse that cost more than most people's rent. Linda went on and on about how she'd seen Emma admiring it in a magazine and just had to make her dreams come true. The woman was acting like she'd won the lottery, describing elaborate shopping trips and consultations with sales associates, talking about custom engravings and special packaging. She'd never been this excited about anything in the entire time I'd known her. Mark kept waiting for her to mention my gift, expecting her to share the same enthusiasm about whatever thoughtful surprise she'd planned for me. But week after week, phone call after phone call, my name never came up. Not once. When Mark finally asked directly, "So what did you get, Sarah?" Linda's tone shifted just slightly. "Oh, don't you worry about that," she said with this mysterious little laugh. "I have something very special in mind for her." The way she said special made my skin crawl, but Mark seemed satisfied with her response. I, however, was starting to get a very bad feeling about this whole situation. Looking back, I think Linda was getting high off the anticipation. She knew exactly what she was planning, and part of her sick enjoyment came from watching us walk unknowingly toward Christmas morning. She was savoring every moment of her elaborate setup, probably counting down the days until she could execute whatever twisted plan she'd been hatching. I just wish I'd trusted my instincts and prepared myself for what was coming. Christmas Eve at Linda's house was tense in a way that I couldn't quite put my finger on, like the air itself was holding its breath. We'd driven over for the traditional family dinner, and I spent the entire evening watching Linda fuss over the perfectly wrapped presents under her tree, each one labeled with beautiful calligraphy and tied with expensive ribbon. There had to be 15 or 20 boxes under there, and I found myself scanning the tags obsessively, looking for my name. Nothing. By the time we were cleaning up after dinner, my anxiety had reached a breaking point, and I pulled Mark aside in the kitchen while Linda was in the living room, arranging and rearranging her gift display like some demented retail artist. "Mark," I whispered, trying to keep my voice casual, "I don't see anything under the tree for me. Are you sure your mom got me something?" He looked genuinely confused and a little worried. "Of course she did. She said she had something special planned, remember?" But even as he said it, I could see doubt creeping into his expression. That's when Linda appeared in the doorway, like she'd been listening the whole time, which, knowing her, she probably had been. "Is everything okay in here?" she asked with that saccharine smile that never reached her eyes. Mark, bless his trusting heart, decided to address it directly. "Mom, Sarah's a little worried because she doesn't see her gift under the tree." Linda's expression shifted so subtly that if you weren't watching carefully, you might have missed it. The smile became sharper, more calculated. "Oh, sweetie," she said, looking directly at me with this pitying expression. "Some people appreciate family more than others. I've learned that over the years." The words hung in the air like a poison cloud. Mark looked between us, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding its source. "What does that mean, Mom?" he asked, but Linda had already turned away, busying herself with wiping down counters that were already spotless. "You'll understand tomorrow," she said cheerfully. "Christmas morning has a way of revealing people's true priorities." I felt like I'd been slapped, but when I looked at Mark, he seemed more confused than alarmed. Linda had just essentially told me I didn't appreciate family enough to deserve a Christmas gift, but she'd done it in such a cryptic way that Mark couldn't quite grasp what had just happened. That night, lying in bed in Linda's guest room, I stared at the ceiling knowing that tomorrow was going to be some kind of test I was destined to fail. Christmas morning unfolded like a perfectly orchestrated psychological torture session, and Linda was the conductor of this twisted symphony. We gathered in the living room after breakfast, and she insisted on her traditional ceremony, where she handed out gifts one by one, making sure everyone watched each person open their present before moving to the next. Jessica went first, naturally, gasping and squealing over that diamond tennis bracelet like she'd just won an Oscar. Linda beamed with pride, soaking up every thank you, and "It's so beautiful," like she was absorbing pure energy. Then came Mark's turn with the Rolex, and I watched my husband's face light up as he opened that expensive box, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife was sitting 3 feet away with nothing in her hands but a growing sense of dread. Emma got her designer purse next, followed by a parade of smaller gifts for various relatives, expensive perfume, cashmere scarves, luxury chocolates. Linda made sure to announce each gift with flourish, explaining why she'd chosen it and how much thought had gone into the selection. Everyone was laughing and taking photos and expressing their amazement at Linda's generosity, and there I sat like a ghost at my own execution. As the pile under the tree dwindled and it became increasingly obvious that there was nothing with my name on it, the room started to feel different. Conversations became more forced, and I could feel people stealing glances at me, then quickly looking away. Linda, meanwhile, was putting on the performance of a lifetime. "Oh my goodness," she suddenly exclaimed, pressing her hand to her chest, like she'd just remembered something terrible. "I feel like I'm forgetting something important." She looked around the room with exaggerated concern, her eyes scanning the empty space under the tree. "Did I? Oh no, I didn't." She trailed off, covering her mouth with her hand in mock horror. Everyone waited for her to rush to her bedroom or the closet to retrieve my forgotten gift, but she just stood there, shaking her head sadly. "I'm getting so forgetful in my old age," she sighed. "I could have sworn I had something, but I suppose if I can't remember, it couldn't have been that important." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's face had gone completely pale, and Jessica was staring at her mother with what looked like barely contained glee. Linda had just publicly humiliated me on Christmas morning and made it look like a senior moment, and we all knew it was completely intentional. The cruelty was breathtaking in its precision. The humiliation was suffocating, like being slowly drowned in a room full of people who were pretending not to notice you couldn't breathe. I sat there frozen, trying to process what had just happened while everyone else seemed paralyzed by the sheer awkwardness of the situation. Mark's uncle cleared his throat and mumbled something about helping in the kitchen, while his cousin suddenly became fascinated by her phone. The silence stretched on until it became physically painful, broken only by the sound of wrapping paper crinkling as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I could feel my face burning with embarrassment, and I knew that if I tried to speak, my voice would crack and betray just how devastated I was. Mark, meanwhile, was staring at his mother with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and something that looked like he was seeing her clearly for the first time in his life. His jaw was clenched so tight I thought he might crack a tooth, and his hands were balled into fists on his lap. But it was Jessica's reaction that really drove the knife home. She wasn't even trying to hide her satisfaction anymore, sitting there with this subtle smirk playing at the corners of her mouth as she admired her new bracelet in the light. She kept glancing between me and her mother like they were sharing some private joke, and when our eyes met, she gave me this little shrug, as if to say, "What did you expect?" Linda had moved on to collecting wrapping paper with theatrical efficiency, humming Christmas carols like nothing had happened. But I could see her stealing glances at me to gauge my reaction. She wanted to see me break, wanted to watch me crumble, or cry, or storm out, so she could tell everyone later how dramatic and ungrateful I was. The room felt like it was closing in on me, and I was fighting every instinct to run to the bathroom and sob when Mark suddenly leaned over and whispered in my ear, his voice barely controlled, "Something's very, very wrong here." Those 7 words hit me like a lifeline because they meant I wasn't crazy, I wasn't imagining things, and I wasn't alone. My husband had finally seen his mother's true face, and in that moment, I knew our lives were about to change forever. The question was whether Linda realized she'd just made the biggest mistake of her manipulative life by pushing Mark too far. The ride home from Linda's house was dead silent, and I could practically feel the anger radiating off Mark in waves. He didn't say a word until we got back to our apartment, and then he immediately picked up his phone and called his mother. I could only hear his side of the conversation, but it was clear Linda was in full damage control mode. "Mom, what the hell was that?" he started, pacing around our living room like a caged animal. "You gave everyone expensive gifts except my wife." "No, that's not an explanation. Of course it was intentional. Stop! Just stop with the innocent act." I watched him run his hands through his hair in frustration as Linda apparently launched into her victim routine on the other end. "You're not getting forgetful, Mom. You're 72, not 92. No, Sarah didn't do anything wrong, because I know you, that's why." The conversation went on for 20 minutes. with Linda cycling through every manipulation tactic in her playbook. She was sorry if I misunderstood. She was just an old woman trying her best. Maybe she was more stressed about money than she'd let on, and her personal favorite, that she never meant to hurt anyone. Mark hung up, more frustrated than when he'd started, and that's when something clicked for me. Money. She'd mentioned money stress, but this was the same woman who just dropped thousands of dollars on Christmas presents like she was Oprah Winfrey. I pulled out my laptop and started doing what I should have done weeks ago, some actual research. While Mark ranted about his mother's non-apologies and crocodile tears, I was digging into Linda's social media, looking at her recent posts about shopping trips and expensive purchases. I started taking screenshots of her bragging about treating herself and living her best life, building a timeline of her sudden spending spree. Something about this whole situation stank worse than weak old fish, and I was determined to figure out what Linda was really up to. Call it intuition, call it paranoia, but I had a feeling that Christmas morning was just the opening act in whatever sick game she was playing. I was about to discover that Linda's generosity came with a price tag that would make your head spin. What I found during my deep dive into Linda's finances made my blood run cold, but also explained everything in the most twisted way possible. It started innocently enough. I was just trying to understand how someone who constantly complained about money could suddenly afford to drop what had to be at least $10,000 on Christmas gifts. I remembered Linda mentioning her financial advisor in passing a few months back, so I started there, doing some casual social media stalking to see if she'd posted about any investments or windfalls. Instead, I found something much more disturbing. Buried in her Facebook posts from the past 3 months were subtle hints about her spending habits that painted a very different picture than the generous grandmother narrative she was pushing. Posts about treating herself after years of sacrifice, comments about money being meant to be spent, and most telling of all, a check-in at a casino from 2 months ago with the caption, "Feeling lucky today." That's when I decided to get serious about this investigation. I convinced Mark to call Linda's bank, pretending to be concerned about potential fraud on her accounts after she'd mentioned some unusual charges during Christmas dinner. What we discovered was financial chaos that would make a bankruptcy lawyer weep. Linda had taken cash advances on multiple credit cards, opened new lines of credit using her house as collateral, and had been living off borrowed money for months. The expensive gifts, the generous spending, the sudden transformation into Lady Bountiful, it was all funded by debt. She'd gone on what could only be described as a manic spending spree, convinced that somehow money would materialize to pay for it all. The woman who had lectured us about fiscal responsibility and living within our means had been charging luxury purchases like she'd won the lottery, except instead of hitting the jackpot, she'd hit rock bottom and was desperately trying to dig her way out. The most infuriating part was realizing that her cruelty toward me on Christmas morning wasn't just petty vindictiveness, it was calculated. She knew she was going to need help paying for her generosity, and she had deliberately excluded me from the gift giving to make it clear that I wasn't entitled to any consideration when the bill came due. Linda had weaponized Christmas presents, and I was about to find out just how expensive her twisted game really was. The full scope of Linda's financial disaster was staggering, and the more we uncovered, the clearer her sick strategy became. We're talking about someone who owed nearly $60,000 across multiple credit cards, personal loans, and cash advances, with minimum payments that exceeded her monthly income by a significant margin. But here's the truly diabolical part. Linda hadn't just gone on a random spending spree and hoped for the best. She had orchestrated this entire crisis with military precision, and those expensive Christmas gifts weren't acts of generosity. They were investments in guilt and obligation. Think about it. She'd given Jessica a $5,000 bracelet, Mark a $3,000 watch, and Emma a $2,000 purse, plus smaller expensive gifts for various family members. Every single present came with an invisible price tag of emotional debt that she fully intended to collect on. Linda had basically bought herself a family of willing contributors to her financial bailout fund, except she'd been smart enough to exclude me from the transaction because she knew I'd be the one to see through her manipulation. The woman had turned Christmas into a pyramid scheme where she was both the scammer and the victim, depending on what served her purposes better in any given moment. Mark found her handwritten notes in her purse during one of our visits, and it was like reading the battle plans of a financial terrorist. She'd calculated how much each family member could reasonably contribute, factored in their guilt levels based on gift value, and had even sketched out conversation starters for when she'd need to make her desperate plea for help. There were bullet points about playing up her loneliness, her fear of losing the house, her shame about being a burden. She'd planned to position herself as the sacrificial mother who had given everything to make her family happy and now needed them to return the favor. The gifts weren't presents. They were down payments on emotional manipulation, and Linda expected a return on her investment that would solve all her problems while making her look like the victim. What she hadn't counted on was her own cruelty backfiring so spectacularly that it opened Mark's eyes to exactly who his mother really was. But Linda was nothing if not persistent, and she was about to make her move whether we were prepared for it or not. 3 weeks after Christmas, Linda called with the kind of audacity that should be studied in psychology textbooks. Mark answered the phone thinking it was going to be her usual guilt trip about something minor, but instead got hit with what can only be described as financial terrorism disguised as a family meeting. "Sweetheart," she started in that syrupy voice she used when she wanted something big, "I need to talk to you and Sarah about something important. I've gotten myself into a bit of a financial pickle, and I was hoping my wonderful family could help me out." When Mark asked what kind of help she needed, Linda dropped the bomb with all the casual confidence of someone ordering coffee. "Well, I owe some money on credit cards, and I was thinking you and Sarah could contribute about $47,000 to help me get back on my feet." The silence on our end must have been deafening because she immediately launched into her prepared speech about how family helps family and how she'd given so much of herself over the years that surely we could find it in our hearts to support her in her time of need. But here's where it gets really rich. She actually had the nerve to suggest that we'd benefited from her generosity and that helping her pay off her debts was just returning the favor. I'm listening to this conversation on speakerphone, watching Mark's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and rage, while his mother explains how we owe her money because she'd bought everyone expensive Christmas presents. The woman who had deliberately humiliated me by excluding me from her gift-giving extravaganza was now demanding that I help pay for those same gifts. Linda even had the audacity to frame it as an investment in family unity and suggested we could set up a payment plan if the lump sum was too difficult. "I know it seems like a lot," she said, "but when you think about how much I've invested in this family over the years, it's really just paying it forward." She talked about the gifts like they were charitable donations we should be grateful for, completely ignoring the fact that her generosity had been funded by borrowed money and emotional manipulation. The sheer entitlement was breathtaking, but what really got me was how she kept saying "you and Sarah" like I was somehow obligated to pay for presents I'd never received. Mark finally managed to stammer out that he needed time to think about it, and Linda cheerfully agreed, saying she'd call back in a few days to work out the details. The follow-up conversation 3 days later was when Linda really showed her true colors, because Mark had the audacity to ask the obvious question: why should Sarah pay for gifts she never received? Linda's response was a masterclass in gaslighting that would have impressed the cult leader. "Oh, sweetheart," she sighed dramatically. "Sarah is part of this family now, whether she got a physical gift or not. Family means sharing both the joys and the burdens, and right now we have a burden that needs sharing. She actually said that with a straight face, as if excluding me from Christmas morning was some kind of spiritual lesson about the true meaning of family. When Mark pointed out the obvious hypocrisy, Linda switched tactics faster than a politician during election season. Suddenly, my lack of a gift became evidence of my character flaws rather than her deliberate cruelty. "I've been watching Sarah for 3 years," she said, "and I've noticed she's not really a gift person. She seems more practical, more focused on financial things than sentimental gestures. I thought she'd actually prefer to contribute to something meaningful rather than receive some trinket she didn't need." The woman had just rewritten history to make my humiliation look like a thoughtful accommodation of my preferences. But she wasn't done yet. Linda then launched into a lecture about how some people show love through giving while others show love through supporting, and how she'd always known Sarah was more of a supporter than a receiver. She made it sound like being excluded from Christmas was actually a compliment, like she'd recognized some noble quality in me that made me too evolved for material gifts. When Mark started pushing back harder, Linda played her final card, the selfishness accusation. "I'm honestly surprised by this reaction," she said, her voice dripping with disappointment. "I raised you to think about family first, not to worry about who got what present. The fact that Sarah is making this about gifts instead of about helping family in crisis makes me wonder about her priorities." She had somehow turned my exclusion from her gift giving into evidence that I was greedy and self-centered, while positioning herself as the victim of our materialism. The gaslighting was so complete and so audacious that for a moment I actually questioned whether I was being unreasonable, which is exactly what she was counting on. Linda had weaponized the concept of family itself, making it mean whatever was convenient for her in any given moment. Mark's investigation into his mother's finances started as damage control, but quickly turned into something that resembled a crime scene investigation, and what he found made our Christmas morning humiliation look like a minor inconvenience compared to the real violation Linda had committed. He'd requested his credit report as part of our mortgage refinancing process, which is when we discovered that someone had been using his social security number to open credit accounts that he'd never authorized. 3 different credit cards, a personal loan, and a line of credit totaling nearly $25,000, all opened within the past 6 months, all tied to addresses where Linda had lived or stayed. When Mark confronted her about it, she initially tried the confusion route, claiming she might have accidentally mixed up their numbers because they were so similar, which is complete nonsense since social security numbers aren't assigned to family members in sequence. But when pressed harder, Linda broke down and admitted she'd used his information just temporarily to help with her cash flow situation and had always planned to transfer everything to her name once things settled down. She actually tried to frame identity theft as a favor she was doing him, explaining that she was building his credit history and that he should be grateful for the opportunities she was creating. The deeper Mark dug, the more extensive her web of financial lies became. She'd been juggling debt between multiple accounts for over a year, taking cash advances from one card to make minimum payments on another, applying for new credit using both her information and Mark's whenever she hit borrowing limits. Linda had essentially been running a one-woman Ponzi scheme with her own family as unwilling investors, and the expensive Christmas gifts were just the latest chapter in her elaborate financial fraud. She'd calculated that the emotional manipulation of generous gift-giving would make it easier to ask for money later. But she'd also hedged her bets by stealing Mark's identity to create backup funding sources. The woman wasn't just manipulative and cruel. She was a straight-up criminal who had been systematically destroying her son's financial future while positioning herself as the victim who needed rescue. Mark was staring at credit reports that could take years to clean up, realizing that his mother hadn't just humiliated his wife, she'd potentially ruined his financial life, and all of it had been premeditated and deliberate. When Mark presented Linda with the evidence of identity theft and demanded she take responsibility for the fraudulent accounts, she dropped the grieving widow act and revealed the vindictive manipulator she'd always been underneath. "Fine," she said, her voice turning ice cold. "If that's how you want to treat your mother after everything I've done for you, then maybe you're not the son I raised. Maybe Sarah has poisoned you against your own family." She actually threatened to disown him, as if losing a relationship with someone who had stolen his identity and humiliated his wife was supposed to be devastating rather than liberating. But Linda wasn't going down without a fight, and within hours of their confrontation, she was working the phones like a political campaign manager, spinning her version of events to anyone who would listen. She called Jessica first, naturally, sobbing about how Mark was abandoning her in her time of need and how I had turned him against his own mother. According to Linda's revised history, she was a desperate widow who had made some unfortunate financial decisions while grieving, and now her ungrateful son was threatening to destroy the family over money. She conveniently left out the identity theft, the deliberate Christmas humiliation, and the calculated manipulation, instead painting herself as a confused elderly woman who just needed support and understanding. Jessica, being the golden child who had never seen Linda's darker side, bought the story completely and started calling Mark to berate him about treating Mom so cruelly. Linda had somehow convinced her that Mark was being financially abusive by refusing to pay her debts, and that I was the mastermind behind this cruelty because I was jealous of their family bond. The woman had turned victim playing into an Olympic sport, complete with strategic tears and carefully timed emotional breakdowns designed to maximize sympathy. She even started posting cryptic messages on social media about learning who your real family is and children who forget where they came from, clearly hoping to generate more support from extended relatives who didn't know the full story. Linda was systematically trying to isolate Mark from his entire family, using his sister as her primary weapon and painting us as the villains in her tragic tale of abandonment. What she didn't realize was that her desperation was making her sloppy, and some family members were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about why someone who was supposedly broke had just given everyone expensive Christmas presents. Her house of cards was beginning to wobble, but Linda was determined to take everyone down with her, rather than face the consequences of her actions alone. After days of Linda's manipulation campaign and watching her try to turn the entire family against us, Mark and I sat down and made the decision that should have happened years ago. We were done playing her games, and it was time to set boundaries that came with actual consequences. We called Linda together, putting her on speakerphone so there could be no miscommunication or selective memory about what was said, and Mark delivered what I can only describe as the most empowering conversation of our entire relationship. "Mom," he started, his voice steady and calm, "we are not paying your debts. Not $47,000, not $47, not 47 cents. You created this financial mess through your own choices, and you will figure out how to fix it without involving us." When Linda immediately launched into her victim routine about being abandoned and betrayed, Mark cut her off with a firmness I'd never heard from him before. "You used my social security number without permission, which is identity theft and a federal crime. You deliberately humiliated Sarah on Christmas morning as part of a calculated plan to manipulate us into paying your bills. You have spent months lying to us about your financial situation while creating debt that you expected us to cover." The silence on her end was telling, but when she tried to interrupt with more excuses, Mark wasn't finished. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to contact the credit card companies and remove my name from all fraudulent accounts, or I'm filing a police report for identity theft. You're going to stop calling family members to spread lies about Sarah and me, or we'll go no contact permanently. And you're going to get professional help for your financial situation because we're not your backup plan anymore." When Linda started crying and claiming she was just a confused old woman, I finally spoke up. Linda, you're not confused. You're manipulative. You planned this whole thing, from the expensive gifts to the identity theft to the family smear campaign. The confused act doesn't work anymore because we see exactly who you are. The conversation ended with us outlining clear consequences. Any continued manipulation would result in immediate no contact. Any further use of Mark's personal information would result in criminal charges, and any attempts to involve other family members in her drama would be met with full disclosure of her financial fraud. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like we were finally fighting back instead of just enduring her abuse, and it was intoxicating. What followed our boundary-setting conversation can only be described as Linda's psychological nuclear meltdown. And let me tell you, when a lifelong manipulator realizes their tactics aren't working anymore, they don't just give up quietly. They escalate to levels that would make a soap opera writer say, "That's too dramatic." It started with the fake medical emergencies, because nothing says, "Pay attention to me," like a mysterious chest pain that requires an ambulance but somehow resolves completely by the time the paramedics arrive. Linda called Mark, in tears, at least 6 times over 2 weeks, claiming everything from heart palpitations to dizzy spells to episodes that sounded suspiciously like panic attacks brought on by the stress of losing control over her favorite victim. When Mark started responding with suggestions that she see a doctor instead of rushing over to comfort her, Linda moved on to her next manipulation tactic, weaponizing his dead father. She started calling him, sobbing about how disappointed Dad would be in Mark's behavior, how his father had always put family first and would be rolling over in his grave, knowing his son was abandoning his mother in her time of need. She even claimed she'd been talking to Dad in her dreams, and that he'd told her Mark was losing his way and needed to remember what family means. When the guilt trips about his father didn't work either, Linda pulled out the big guns and started making vague threats about not wanting to be a burden anymore and how maybe everyone would be better off without her. She left voicemails about cleaning out her closets and getting her affairs in order, sent text messages about feeling so alone and wondering if this is how it ends, and even called Jessica crying about how she couldn't go on knowing her son hated her. The suicide threats were particularly manipulative because Linda knew Mark's biggest fear was losing another parent, and she was essentially holding her own life hostage to try to force compliance with her demands. But here's the thing about extinction bursts. They're actually a sign that the manipulation is failing, not succeeding. Linda was throwing every desperate tactic she could think of at the wall to see what would stick, and the fact that she'd escalated to fake medical emergencies and suicide threats meant that her usual guilt trips and victim playing weren't working anymore. Mark was finally seeing through her performance, and Linda was losing her mind trying to regain control over a situation that had already slipped through her fingers completely. The family fracture that followed Linda's extinction burst was swift and brutal, dividing relatives into camps like some twisted civil war where the weapon of choice was emotional manipulation instead of actual artillery. Jessica, predictably, started as Linda's most vocal defender, calling Mark daily to lecture him about abandoning Mom when she needs us most, and posting passive-aggressive social media messages about children who forget their responsibilities. She organized a family intervention where she ambushed Mark with cousins and aunts, all primed with Linda's version of events about the heartless son who was choosing money over family. But Jessica's unwavering loyalty started to crack when Linda's desperation made her sloppy and she began contradicting her own lies in ways that were impossible to ignore. When Jessica offered to help Linda organize her finances to prove she wasn't as bad off as Mark claimed, Linda panicked and made increasingly elaborate excuses about why her paperwork wasn't available, why the bank statements were confusing, and why Jessica couldn't speak directly to her financial advisor. The turning point came when Jessica discovered Linda had been lying about the timeline of her debt, claiming the financial problem started after Christmas when Jessica had personally witnessed Linda's shopping sprees throughout the fall. Meanwhile, the extended family was choosing sides based on incomplete information and personal loyalties, with Mark's uncle and several cousins cutting contact entirely after Linda convinced them that we were trying to steal her house and abandon her to die alone. His Aunt Mary, who had always been jealous of Linda's financial stability, was particularly vicious in her condemnation, posting on Facebook about ungrateful children and women who destroy families, clearly enjoying the opportunity to knock Linda down a few pegs while appearing morally superior. But Linda's manipulation campaign also backfired in unexpected ways, because some family members started asking uncomfortable questions about how someone who was supposedly broke could afford such expensive Christmas gifts, and why a confused elderly woman seemed so strategically focused on destroying her son's reputation. Jessica's husband was the first to point out that Linda's story didn't add up, and gradually Jessica began to see the patterns of manipulation that Mark had been dealing with for years. The family may have been divided, but Linda's web of lies was finally starting to unravel as people realized that maybe the victim wasn't who they thought she was. Reality has a funny way of catching up with people like Linda, and it turns out that when you've burned all your bridges while standing on a foundation of credit card debt, the collapse is both inevitable and spectacular. Within 2 months of our confrontation, Linda was forced to file for bankruptcy after the credit card companies started demanding payment, and she had no family members left willing to fund her lifestyle. The house she'd used as collateral for her spending spree went into foreclosure. And suddenly, the woman who had been playing generous benefactor was living in a tiny studio apartment and working part-time at a department store to make ends meet. Jessica finally saw the full scope of her mother's manipulation when she had to help Linda move and discovered boxes of receipts, credit applications, and handwritten notes outlining her strategy for guilt-tripping family members into paying her debts. Meanwhile, Mark and I were stronger than we'd ever been, bonded by the shared trauma of surviving his mother's psychological warfare and emerging with our sanity and marriage intact. The identity theft situation took months to resolve, but watching Linda face actual consequences for her actions was worth every hour we spent on the phone with credit agencies. Of course, Linda's apology, when it finally came, was exactly what you'd expect from someone who had never taken responsibility for anything in her life. "I'm sorry things got so out of hand," she said during an awkward phone call. "But I was grieving and desperate, and I thought my family would understand that sometimes people make mistakes when they're in pain. I never meant for anyone to get hurt, and I hope someday you'll realize that everything I did came from a place of love, even if it didn't seem that way." Notice how she apologized for things getting out of hand, rather than for her deliberate cruelty, how she blamed grief for calculated financial fraud, and how she ended by suggesting that we were the ones who needed to change our perspective about her love. Even in defeat, Linda couldn't resist one final manipulation attempt, positioning herself as the misunderstood victim, whose intentions had been pure even if her methods were questionable. But for the first time in 3 years, her words had no power over us, because we finally understood exactly who she was, and more importantly, who we were when we refused to be her victims anymore. Looking back now, 6 months later, I can honestly say that cutting Linda out of our lives was the best decision we ever made, and the peace that comes from not walking on eggshells around a master manipulator is worth more than any relationship with someone who sees you as nothing more than a potential ATM with emotions to exploit. Mark and I are stronger than ever because we've been through psychological warfare together and came out the other side as a united team rather than victims of family dysfunction. We've kept our boundaries rock solid. Linda has tried to worm her way back in through flying monkeys and guilt trips, but we've learned to recognize her tactics and shut them down immediately. The best part is watching Mark finally understand that choosing his wife over his abusive mother isn't betrayal, it's growth, and that setting boundaries with toxic people isn't cruel, it's necessary for survival. We've built a life based on mutual respect and genuine affection instead of obligation and manipulation, and every holiday we spend together without Linda's drama is a reminder of what healthy relationships actually look like. I sleep better knowing that I'll never again have to endure Christmas mornings where someone deliberately humiliates me as part of an elaborate financial scam, and Mark has finally stopped making excuses for behavior that was never acceptable in the first place. Linda occasionally surfaces on social media with posts about children who abandon their parents and the importance of forgiveness, but we've learned to scroll past her victim performance because we know the truth about who she really is underneath the act. Sometimes I wonder if we should feel guilty about refusing to enable her anymore, but then I remember that woman who sat there on Christmas morning, savoring my humiliation while planning to demand money for presents I never received. The truth is, some people don't deserve access to your life, even if they're family. And protecting your peace is more important than maintaining relationships with people who see your kindness as weakness to exploit. So here's my question for you. Do you think we went too far by cutting her off completely, or should we have gone even further and pressed charges for the identity theft? Let me know in the comments because I'm genuinely curious whether people think we were too harsh or not harsh enough with someone who spent years systematically abusing our trust and love.